If you drive in New York, or if you do business there, ship goods through there, or have family who commutes there, something fundamental is about to shift. Starting next month, the state is rolling out a new set of road rules that go beyond the usual tweaks to speed limits or turn signals. These changes touch on how traffic is monitored, how violations are enforced, and in some cases, how much it's going to cost you if you're not paying attention. This isn't speculation. The legislation passed months ago. The infrastructure is already being installed, and the compliance deadlines are real. Yet most people outside Albany seem unaware of what's coming. For a state that moves more freight than almost anywhere else in the country, that hosts millions of daily commuters, and that serves as a critical corridor for interstate commerce, changes like these don't stay local for long. They set precedents. They influence how other states think about enforcement, revenue, and road safety. And they raise bigger questions about oversight, fairness, and whether drivers are being adequately informed before the rules take effect. So let's talk about what's actually changing, because the details matter more than the headlines suggest. New York is implementing what officials are calling a modernized traffic enforcement system, and it includes expanded use of automated speed cameras, stricter penalties for repeat offenders, revised rules around commercial vehicle weight limits, and new protocols for how violations are processed and contested. On the surface, these sound like reasonable updates. Road safety is important. Enforcement needs to evolve with technology. But when you start to look at how this is being rolled out, the timing, the scope, and the lack of public conversation around it, things start to feel less straightforward. The speed camera expansion is probably the most visible part of this. New York already has one of the most extensive networks of automated enforcement cameras in the country, particularly in New York City. But starting in February, the state is authorizing the deployment of these cameras in school zones, work zones, and what they're calling high-risk corridors across upstate New York, the Hudson Valley, and parts of Long Island that previously had little to no automated enforcement. The cameras will operate around the clock, not just during school hours. They'll be tied to a centralized database that tracks violations across jurisdictions, meaning a ticket you get in Buffalo can now factor into your driving record in a way that influences insurance rates, license suspensions, and future penalties statewide. The fines themselves are also going up. What used to be a $50 or $75 ticket for going 10 miles over the limit in a school zone is now starting at $125 for a first offense, and it escalates quickly from there. Now, proponents of this system argue that it's about saving lives. They point to data showing that speed-related accidents have increased in recent years, that distracted driving is a persistent problem, and that traditional enforcement by patrol officers is inconsistent and resource-intensive. They say automated systems are fairer because they don't involve discretion or bias, that everyone is held to the same standard. And there's some truth to that. But what they don't talk about as much is the revenue side of the equation. New York is projecting that these new cameras will generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually in fines and fees. That money is supposed to be earmarked for road improvements and public safety programs, but budget documents show that a significant portion is actually going into the general fund, which means it's being used to patch holes in the state budget that have nothing to do with traffic or infrastructure. That raises questions about whether this is really about safety or whether it's about finding a politically palatable way to increase state revenue without calling it a tax. Then, there's the issue of how these violations are being processed. Under the new system, if you get a ticket from an automated camera, you're not dealing with a traffic court in the traditional sense. You're dealing with an administrative hearing process that operates under different rules. You don't have the same right to cross-examine witnesses. You don't have the same burden of proof protections. The presumption is that the camera system is accurate unless you can prove otherwise, and proving otherwise requires technical knowledge, access to calibration records, and often legal representation that most people can't afford. There have already been cases in other states with similar systems where cameras were later found to be miscalibrated, where yellow light timing was shortened to increase red light violations, where contracts with private vendors created financial incentives to issue more tickets rather than fewer. New York says they've built in safeguards to prevent that, but those safeguards are largely internal. There's no independent oversight body, there's no automatic audit process, and the companies that manufacture and maintain these systems have a track record of lobbying aggressively to expand their use, which creates a built-in conflict of interest. The commercial vehicle rules are another piece of this that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. New York is tightening enforcement on weight limits, axle configurations, and routing restrictions for trucks, and they're doing it at a time when supply chains are still fragile and freight costs are elevated. The new rules require more frequent weigh station stops, more documentation, and higher fines for violations that used to be handled with warnings. For small trucking companies and independent owner-operators, this is a real financial burden. It increases transit times, it increases costs, and in some cases, it's forcing drivers to take longer, less efficient routes to avoid certain checkpoints. That might not sound like a big deal until you think about how much of the country's goods move through New York. It's a major corridor for everything from agricultural products coming out of the Midwest to manufactured goods coming into the port of Newark and moving north into New England. When you slow that down or make it more expensive, those costs get passed along. They show up in grocery prices, in retail prices, in the cost of doing business for companies that rely on just-in-time logistics. And here's where this starts to connect to the broader economy. New York isn't operating in a vacuum. Other states are watching what happens here. California has already signaled interest in expanding its own automated enforcement systems. Illinois is considering similar legislation. New Jersey has been using red light cameras for years and is now exploring speed cameras. If New York's rollout is seen as successful, meaning if it generates revenue without sparking a major political backlash, you're going to see this model replicated across the country. That's not necessarily a bad thing if it's done transparently and with genuine public safety goals. But if it becomes another revenue mechanism disguised as public policy, if it disproportionately affects working people who can't afford the fines or the legal help to contest them, if it creates a system where driving becomes prohibitively expensive for people who don't have access to public transit, then we're looking at something that deepens inequality rather than addressing it. There's also a privacy dimension to this that isn't getting discussed enough. These camera systems don't just record your speed. They record your license plate, the time and location of your travel, and in some cases they use facial recognition or vehicle identification algorithms that can track patterns over time. That data is being stored. It's being shared across law enforcement agencies. And while New York says it's only being used for traffic enforcement, there's no legal barrier preventing it from being used for other purposes down the line. We've seen this happen with other surveillance technologies. They get introduced for one narrow purpose, and then over time the use cases expand. Suddenly, the same system that was sold as a way to catch speeders is being used to track protesters, to monitor immigration status, to build profiles on individuals who haven't committed any crime. That might sound paranoid, but it's exactly what happened with license plate readers in other states. The infrastructure is already there. The question is who controls it and what limits exist on how it can be used. Now, let's talk about what this means for everyday people. If you're a commuter driving into New York City from Connecticut or New Jersey, you're now navigating a system where a single mistake, a moment of distraction, a failure to notice that the speed limit dropped from 55 to 35 can result in a ticket that costs more than a day's pay. And because these systems are automated, there's no opportunity for a warning, no conversation with an officer who might use discretion, no chance to explain that you were keeping pace with traffic or that the signage was unclear. You just get a notice in the mail weeks later with a fine and a deadline to pay or contest. And contesting it means taking time off work, navigating a bureaucratic process, and in many cases paying the fine anyway because it's easier than fighting it. For people living paycheck to paycheck, this isn't a minor inconvenience. It's a financial crisis. It can mean choosing between paying the ticket and paying rent. It can mean losing your license because you couldn't afford the fines, which then means losing your job because you can't get to work. And this is where the economic impact starts to compound. When you increase the cost of driving, you increase the cost of living. You make it harder for people to access employment opportunities that aren't served by public transit. You make it harder for small businesses to operate if their employees or their customers are getting hit with fines that affect their ability to spend money elsewhere. You create a situation where people who are already economically vulnerable are being pushed further to the margins by a system that's supposed to be neutral, but in practice is anything but. The people who can afford to live in walkable neighborhoods with good transit access, who can afford legal representation, who have the flexibility to contest tickets without losing income, they're largely insulated from this. The people who can't, they're the ones who bear the cost. There's also a broader question here about how we think about governance and accountability. When you automate enforcement, you remove the human element. That can be good in terms of reducing bias, but it also removes judgment, context, and the ability to respond to individual circumstances. A police officer pulling someone over can see that they're rushing to the hospital, that they're dealing with an emergency, that the violation was unintentional. A camera can't do that. It just records the violation and issues the ticket. And while there are processes in place to contest tickets, those processes are designed to be efficient for the state, not accessible for the individual. They're designed to process high volumes, to minimize appeals, to generate revenue. That's not inherently corrupt, but it does create a system where the incentives are misaligned with the stated goals. So, what should people be doing right now? First, if you drive in New York or plan to, you need to be aware of where these cameras are being deployed. The state is required to publish a map, but it's not always easy to find, and it's not always updated in real time. Second, you need to understand your rights. If you get a ticket, you have the right to request evidence, to see the calibration records for the camera, to challenge the accuracy of the system. Most people don't know that, and the notice you get in the mail doesn't make it clear. Third, and this is important, you need to be paying attention to how this issue is being discussed at the state and local level. Are elected officials talking about this as a revenue measure or as a safety measure? Are they being transparent about how the money is being used? Are they open to independent oversight and accountability? Because if they're not, that tells you something about their priorities. This is also a moment to think about what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want a system where every minor infraction is monitored, recorded, and punished automatically? Do we want a system where driving becomes a minefield of potential fines, where you're constantly worried about whether you accidentally went 3 miles over the limit in a zone you didn't know was being monitored? Or do we want a system that balances safety with fairness, that uses technology to support human judgment rather than replace it, that treats people as citizens rather than revenue sources? These are not abstract questions. They're being answered right now through the policies that are being implemented, and most people aren't even aware it's happening. The reality is that New York's new road rules are part of a much larger trend. Across the country, state and local governments are looking for ways to increase revenue without raising taxes, and automated enforcement is an appealing option because it's politically easier to sell. But just because something is politically convenient doesn't mean it's good policy. And just because something is framed as being about safety doesn't mean that safety is the primary motivation. We need to be asking harder questions about who benefits from these systems, who pays the cost, and whether the trade-offs are worth it. Because once this infrastructure is in place, it's very hard to roll back. The cameras don't come down, the fines don't go away, the data doesn't get deleted. What starts as a pilot program becomes permanent, and what's sold as a targeted solution becomes a blanket system that affects everyone. So as February approaches and these new rules take effect, pay attention. Watch how this unfolds. See whether the promises match the reality. And if you have concerns, speak up. Contact your representatives, attend public meetings, use the tools of democracy to push back if you think this is heading in the wrong direction. Because the decisions being made right now, in the name of efficiency and safety and modernization, are decisions that will shape how we live, how we move, and how much freedom we have to do both. And that's not something we should be leaving to bureaucrats and contractors and automated systems to decide for us.